Hello everyone, and welcome back to Game Easy, Roll Good. Today we're going to continue the series on all the spell changes in the Dungeons & Dragons 2024 Player's Handbook. I already did my video on the cantrips and first level spells. This video will cover the second and third level spells, and we'll do 4th and 5th, 6th and 7th, 8th and 9th. This one is also a long one, but they should get shorter as we go on as there's just fewer and fewer spells at each level. But before we get started with that, if you are a new viewer to this channel or returning viewer who hasn't quite hit that subscribe button yet, please consider hitting that subscribe button either now or at some point during this video if you like what you see. We're in that final stretch towards 1,000 subscribers, so every little bit helps, and I appreciate all your guys' support. I will have all my spell change videos in a playlist that'll be available down in the description, as well as, of course, on my channel page. We have a lot to get through today. We actually have more spells than the last one. There's a lot of second and third level spells. Let's just go ahead and get started. Starting off with A, there was just a small change to the material component where it no longer specifies that the strip of cloth needs to be tiny. Alter Self was changed pretty significantly. So first, it's a magic action to choose which alteration you do. For the aquatic adaptation, you have a swim speed equal to your speed, not just your walking speed. For the change appearance alteration, it is a magic action to change your appearance within that alteration. And then finally, for the natural weapons, it no longer suggests other natural weapons. So technically here, you're just limited to claws, fangs, horns, or hooves. Previously, it said you could choose like another sort of natural weapon that you could think of, maybe like a beak or something along those lines. But within the rules, at least for this spell in 2024, you just have one of these four. I presume that a reasonable DM would let you choose a different natural weapon if you took a different form, but those are the only ones listed here. Another thing is that the natural weapons now use your spellcasting ability modifier for attack and damage rolls, rather than I think it was strength in 2014. And you also no longer have a +1 to attack and damage rolls with those weapons, and they're also no longer considered magical damage. Moving on to Animal Messenger, the beast must now fail a charisma saving throw in order for the effect to take place. Beast also automatically succeeds the saving throw if its CR is 0 or higher. I feel like these are some pretty odd changes. Like, I understand that enchantment can be a very twisted school of magic, but I've never considered the spell to be like imposing your will or something upon another beast. It was always like more of like a Disney princess talking to animals and like having them go deliver a message. But overall, I think the saving throw and the CR restriction is a little odd. I don't know how the designers think this spell is being used or what their reasoning is for this change. This spell is just effectively a downranked sort of snail mail version of sending, because it's also a ritual, so it's kind of risk-free to cast it. I mean, you can, and it doesn't say that you couldn't try again if you wanted to. And I guess technically, depending on your relationship with that beast, the beast could just decide to fail the saving throw if you've kind of already had a relationship of some kind with it, or you've used like a Speak with Animals or another spell to kind of let it know what's going on, so it can kind of agree to send that message for you. If it chooses to fail the saving throw, that would supersede both the saving throw component as well as the CR restriction, because even if you automatically succeed it, you're still choosing to fail. Moving on to Arcane Lock, it now specifies any container instead of just a chest, hatch instead of other entryway. The spell also specifies that it's magically locked. It can also no longer be opened by Thieves' Tools, sort of lock-picking it with a harder DC. So once it's locked, it's just locked and can only be opened the ways described in the spell. The spell no longer mentions the knock spell being able to suppress the effect of the Arcane Lock, but the knock spell likely covers this on its own. Moving on to Augury, this one is unchanged. For the spell Beast Sense, you can now simultaneously benefit from the beast senses as well as your own senses. This would be especially useful for a Beastmaster Ranger or anyone with a non-familiar type beast or pet or companion. The Blindness Deafness spell, the school was changed to Transmutation from Necromancy, and it had its range increased to 120 feet from 30 feet, so that's a pretty significant range boost. The Blur spell now specifically needs Blind Sight or True Sight to see through the effect rather than any similar sense that might see through it. Previously in 2014, it said, a sense that can see through illusions like True Sight or the ability to see without your eyes, such as Blind Sight, but now it just specifically says Blind Sight or True Sight. For the Calm Emotion spell, the text that it can be willingly failed, it was now removed, but of course this is a default rule in 2024 now that anyone can willingly fail a saving throw. Creatures affected by the spell have immunity to the Charmed and Frightened condition, in addition to the fact that it suppresses those conditions while the spell is active on a target who is already charmed or frightened, and now uses the actual indifferent and hostile keywords, although the text and the effect of this is basically the same. And at the end of that last bullet point, it no longer states that the creature's attitude returns to normal unless the DM rules otherwise. Of course, I think that's technically always implicit because the DM can always make whatever adjudication that they want, but that is no longer explicitly stated in the rules of the spell. Moving on to Cloud of Daggers. Cloud of Daggers has had some small changes, but pretty notable changes. The first thing is that it now does damage immediately when it is cast over a creature's space. And again, there's no saving throw with the spell. There never was in 2014, and there isn't now. So there's no save or half. They just take the damage. It also does damage again if a creature ends its turn there, whereas previously this was starts its turn. And it also, of course, does damage again if the effect is moved onto their space. And that is because you can now also use a magic action to teleport the cube up to 30 feet. So on each of your turns, you can just keep moving the cube around. And of course, recently I did a video on spells and their shapes. So according to the rules within the book, a point within range would be an intersection of squares, sort of the corners of 4 squares, and that a cube extends from one of the faces of the cube outwards from it. So if we wanted to look at a valid placing of Cloud of Daggers, it would look something like this. So we can see that you measure from an intersection of squares and you measure outwards 5 feet from that. And so the most amount of space that this spell can cover is 2 adjacent squares. And an invalid placing of Cloud of Daggers might look like this. You are measuring from an intersection of squares, but you are measuring the point of origin incorrectly because it's supposed to be outward from the point of origin along the face. And additionally, if you're going by the rules that the spell needs to cover at least half of the square in order to affect it, of course, this placement is only covering a quarter of each square, so none of those goblins would be affected even though it's touching their square. So when you do place a Cloud of Daggers or a similar shaped spell, you'd want to place it similar to the first 2 pictures and not the last one. Moving on to Continual Flame, there are some wording changes here, but it's effectively unchanged. Cordon of Arrows. So the ammunition now can't be physically uprooted during the spell. So you can't have, your enemies like walk up and pull them out of the ground. The damage was increased to 2d4 from 1d6. And now the spend ends early if none of the ammunition remains planted in the ground. Previously, it just said when none of the ammunition remains. I don't know if that means that it could theoretically be magically removed from the ground through like a telekinesis, or a mage hand could even possibly move it. I don't know if that's what they intend. Also, technically, since the ammunition isn't being worn or carried, if they're caught in the range of something like a fireball, I would say they would presumably be destroyed, similar to like a shatter spell as well. Crown of Madness was updated in that it's a magic action to maintain control of the spell, whereas previously this was just an action. There's several other wording changes, but it's effectively the same spell. The Darkness spell now actually uses the Darkness keyword in the rules glossary, which has its own set of rules. It no longer spreads around corners. Casting it on an object turns it into an emanation centered on that object. The light in the last sentence is changed to specifically bright or dim light rather than just generic light, and the material component no longer includes a drop of pitch. Moving on to Dark Vision, the range is increased to 150 feet from 60 feet, and the material component no longer includes an agate. For Detect Thoughts, there's a number of changes here, more than I can fit on the screen, so I'm just going to go through them now. So all actions to either sense or read creatures' thoughts are now magic actions from actions, no surprises there. Creatures that can't speak or with an intelligence of 3 or lower are no longer unaffected. However, about midway down in the read thoughts section of it, it does say that if the target doesn't know any language and isn't telepathic, then they aren't affected because they just have no ability to communicate. The spell now has 2 modes, Sense Thoughts and Read Thoughts. Both of these were functions of the old spell, but they have minor functional differences. Sense Thoughts lets you detect the presence of thinking creatures within 30 feet. Notably, this is now blocked by 1 foot of stone as well as dirt or wood, which is new, or 1 inch of metal. Both of these measurements are down from 2 feet and 2 inches respectively. So we've seen this a lot with a lot of spells that have these sort of blocked by certain materials that the measurements have been reduced. So now it's easier to block these spells, which is interesting. For Read Thoughts, you specifically need to have used your Sense Thoughts first to detect that the creature is a thinking creature before you can use Read Thoughts on it. Additionally, the intelligence check to end the Read Thoughts effect when you've probed deeper into their brain now benefits from Arcana proficiency, so it's a little easier to break that effect if they are proficient in Arcana. Moving on to Enhanceability, this was kind of oddly nerfed. So in 2024, this just gives you advantage on one of Strength, Dexterity, Intelligence, Wisdom, or Charisma checks for the duration. In 2014, this not only included Constitution checks, but it also for Strength, Dexterity, and Constitution, they had secondary effects, such as 2d6 temporary hit points for the Constitution one, doubling your carry capacity for the Strength one, as well as preventing fall damage for falls 20 feet or less for the Dexterity one. I'm not sure why they chose to remove those secondary effects and remove Constitution. I know there aren't really that many Constitution checks in Dungeons & Dragons. Again, very strange spells. I would probably continue using the old 2014 version just because it's just better. I don't think it was overpowered that it had extra effects. Either way, strange ones, I'm probably going to still use the 2014 version. Moving on to enlarge reduce, there's been some small changes here. So now it specifies that the thrown weapons and ammunition return to normal size, whereas previously in 2014 it just said that if you drop a weapon or ammunition that it returns to a normal size, but now it's also as if it's thrown or fired. Both the enlarge and reduce no longer specify that the target's size and weight is increased or decreased 8-fold. And interestingly, for the enlarge effect, it no longer restricts the ability to grow if there isn't enough space. I tried to look in like size in the rules glossary and I didn't see anything mentioned there, so I don't know if that's mentioned somewhere else in the book, but is no longer mentioned in this spell. So presumably even if you don't have enough space to become large, presumably you would still become large and maybe follow the squeeze rules or something like that, but I just thought that was an interesting change. Moving on to Enthrall, this now requires concentration, whereas it didn't previously. The target no longer needs to be able to hear you. Creatures you are fighting automatically succeed, whereas previously they just had advantage on the save. It no longer applies the charmed condition, so this now applies to creatures who are immune to being charmed. And the effect of it now is that it provides a -10 to wisdom perception checks and passive perception, whereas previously they just had disadvantage on perception check. And it now no longer ends if the target can no longer hear you. So this is actually a really interesting spell now, because if you imagine stacking this with Pass Without Trace, which we'll take a look at a little bit later, you can give all of your allies in your emanation +10 to their stealth check, and then if you cast this over creatures that you can see within range, then any one of them who fails the saving throw would then have -10 to their perception checks, even their passive perception, to try to see you. So that's effectively a +20 to your stealth for creatures who are affected by this spell. Moving on to Find Steed, this now uses a fixed stat block that is in the spell. We'll take a look at that in a second. Rather than choosing a specific beast, the mount can technically look however you would like it to look, within reason, of course. They did nerf it a little bit, where spells that you cast on yourself previously also affected your steeds. All of that has been removed, and it does have some potential upcasting now, although upcasting just benefits a few different things in their stat block. So looking at the stat block, for hit points, it starts with 5 + 10 per spell level, and again, it's a second level spell, so you start with 25 hit points. This is better than all of the suggested mounts in the 2014 rules. The highest one was 19 for the Warhorse, so you're starting off with more hit points than you normally would. You do also get a 60-foot fly speed if you cast the spell at 4th level or higher. You have telepathy within 1 mile, and it only works with you. The old spell also gave you telepathy, so this isn't a new feature, but it is a feature that wasn't removed. There is a feature called Life Bond that says when you regain hit points from a level 1 or higher spell, the steed also regains the same number of hit points. This was sort of mimicking the ability that when you cast a spell on yourself that it also affects your steed, although this is only for regaining hit points, although specifically you don't need to cast the spell if you are healed by another ally and you're within 5 feet of your steed, then they also benefit from that effect. So that's pretty cool. The stat block for the steed also has an attack, and this specifically benefits from your spell attack modifier and does additional damage equal to the level of the spell. So there's some minor scaling there. And additionally, based on the creature type that you choose for the steed, there are some additional once per day bonus actions that you can use. You can pause to read them here. I'm not going to go through them. Moving on to Find Traps, the only real change here is that it defines traps as any object or mechanism that was created to cause damage or other danger. Previously in 2014, this was anything that would inflict a sudden or unexpected effect you consider harmful or undesirable. I don't know if this has any sort of mechanical impact or if this is just, I don't know why they changed this wording specifically. At the end of the day, Find Traps still doesn't find traps. It just lets you know that they're there, and it lets you know what the function of that trap is. So I really feel like this should just be called Detect Traps, because that's all it really does. It's basically detect magic for traps. And on that note, I think it should probably just be a level 1 spell and a ritual, much like Detect Magic. Otherwise, it just feels so useless. I don't know why someone would take the time to cast this, or even take the time to learn this. Moving on to Flame Blade, this ability has been buffed a little bit, so it's now a magic action to attack with it from just an action. You also add your spellcasting ability modifier to the damage, which is pretty cool. For the upcasting, the damage now increases with every spell level that you upcast it, rather than every 2 levels. For Flaming Sphere, ramming a creature now moves the sphere into their space. I don't know that that has any other mechanical impacts to my knowledge, but it now specifically says into a creature's space. Objects affected by the sphere now have the burning hazard applied, and the material component was changed to a ball of wax. For Gentle Repose, the material components in 2014 did include 2 copper pieces that you placed on the eyes of the affected creature. However, in 2024, it just says that the spell consumes those components. This also changes the function of the spell, because it means that you can't use the spellcasting focus in place of the item. You actually need to use 2 copper pieces, and you then lose those 2 copper pieces in order to cast the spell. Moving on to Gust of Wind, this is effectively unchanged, although reading this I was like, oh, this is a 10-foot wide line. And again, I just did that video recently about spell sizes and their shapes, and then again, I pointed out rules as written. If you cast a line at a diagonal, it takes up so much more space than you would think it would. So I just kind of wanted to point this one out here, that if you cast a line that is 10 feet wide on a diagonal, you actually take up this much space. So normally if you cast it horizontally or vertically, it would just be 2 squares wide, whereas this one takes up 3 squares at its widest, and it's like double the amount of space that would normally take up. So again, if your DM is ruling shapes, rules as written, and you're casting a spell that is a line, try to cast them on a diagonal if you can. Moving on to Heat Metal. The only change here is that you must be within the spell's range of the object to continue causing damage each turn. Previously, you could do it from any distance after you cast the spell, but you still need to be within 60 feet now. For Hold Person, the only change here is that the material component for the piece of iron no longer needs to be small. For Invisibility, the spell now also ends early if you deal damage. So the one thing the spell doesn't cover is if you have a non-spell effect that imposes a saving throw but deals no damage. I imagine there are many class features that would work this way. Moving on to Knock, this is unchanged. Lesser Restoration is now a bonus action from an action, which is actually really, really good quality of life. It's one of those spells that you kind of want to have in your back pocket, but it feels so bad to cast it as an action because outside of Paralyzed, none of these conditions are that impactful. Rather, but now if this is just a bonus action, I might consider using this on a blinded or even poisoned creature. But now since this is just a bonus action, I might actually consider keeping this in my pocket and using it on a blinded or even poisoned ally. Moving on to Levitate, it is now a magic action to move the targeted creature, whereas previously this was just a regular action, and the material component is now just a metal spring. For Locate Animals or Plants, you can also additionally locate plant creatures, but you can only locate non-magical plants. Locate Object was unchanged. For Magic Mouth, the material component no longer includes Honeycomb. For Magic Weapon, the duration no longer requires concentration, which is actually pretty cool. It still just affects a non-magical weapon, so this kind of becomes irrelevant at a certain point, unless you somehow lose your weapon, like if you get taken prisoner and they take your effects away and then you're having to use a mundane weapon in your jailbreak. Maybe that's a situation where at higher levels you'd want to cast this. Or if you're on an escort quest and someone has a mundane weapon that they're using, like an NPC, you can cast this on their weapon and it would be better that way. But yeah, no longer requires concentration. It ends early if you cast it again during the duration, which makes sense, and it can now be upcast to a +2 bonus between levels 3 and 5, whereas in 2014 this was just level 4 or higher. Moving on to Mind Spike, this was added to the player's handbook from Xanathar's Guide to Everything. It had its range doubled to 120 feet from 60 feet, so that's pretty cool. As someone who's a fan of divination wizards, I do appreciate that there are more divination spells, and I think there's also one other spell change in this video where a school was changed to divination. And I guess a question I would pose to you all, if you have created or if you were going to create additional divination type spells, how would they work? Because I know divination typically has a limited range of effects that it can do, and which is maybe part of the reason that there just aren't that many of them. But again, if you were going to create or have created, homebrew divination spells, what would those look like? I'd definitely be interested to know that down in the comments. For Melf's Acid Arrow, the material component no longer includes an adder's stomach. Mirror Image is functionally the same spell, although it works a little bit differently now in 2024. So this now triggers on hit rather than it was previously triggered when you were targeted by an attack roll. And how it works now is that you roll 1d6 per image instead of a 1d20 period. So if you have 3 images, you're rolling 3d6, 2 images, 2d6, and 1 image, 1d6. When you roll those 3d6, if any of those d6 have a result of 3 or higher, then an image is hit and it is destroyed. Images no longer have their own AC, so they are just hit by the attack and destroyed. Additionally, creatures with the blinded condition are not affected, rather than just creatures who can't see. So this now does affect the chances that you are not hit and that one of your images is hit instead. So when you're rolling the 3d6, the chances that at least one of them is going to be a 3 or higher is 96%. You're rolling the 2d6, that drops to an 89%, and then at 1d6, it's 66%. Whereas previously, if you're just rolling the 1d20, you had a 75% chance with 3 images, 65 with 2, and 50% chance with 1. So the odds to hit a duplicate are higher in 2024, but there's no chance to keep the duplicates around because they don't have their own AC, such that the attack might miss them, and then you would continue having those images. So you're now less likely to get hit, but you can't keep those images around quite as long. Misty Step is unchanged. Moonbeam has had a few different changes, so it is now a magic action to move the Moonbeam from an action, which is understandable. It did have some damage timing added or changed, so it now does damage when it appears, much like the Cloud of Daggers. It also does damage when it is moved into a creature's space, much like Cloud of Daggers, and it also deals damage when the creature ends its turn in their space from the start of their turn. It also affects any creatures that are shape-shifted, not just shape changers. Specifically here in the spell, it calls out creatures who have been polymorphed, for example, and the material component was changed to just a moon seed leaf. Moving on to Nistle's Magic Aura, the two effects of the spell are now tied to a creature or an object, whereas previously you could potentially apply both effects to either of those. So the mask ability is now tied to creatures only, and it no longer states that the creature is treated as the alignment of the creature that you are masked as well. You're just that chosen creature type. I don't know if typing would technically include alignment, but it is no longer explicitly stated in that spell. And then the False Aura effect of the spell is specifically for objects, and it no longer states that you can make the False Aura apparent to people who handle the object. So for Pass Without Trace, this is now a 30-foot emanation, which I think clears up some of the confusion around this one, because I know some people treated it as an emanation originally. Some people treated it like creatures who are in the area when you cast the spell were affected, and then they could go off on their own and do other things. But specifically, they now need to stay in your aura to continue having the effect. And then the material component no longer includes a sprig of spruce. Phantasmal Force now affects undead and constructs, and then much like other illusion spells that we've seen, it is now a study action to investigate an illusion from just an action. There's other small wording changes here, but it is still mechanically the same spell. For Prayer of Healing, this is changed to Abjuration from Evocation. Affected creatures must remain in the area during the casting of the spell to gain the benefit of it. Affected creatures now additionally gain the benefit of a short rest, and they can only have this benefit once per long rest for the spell. So that's pretty cool. It kind of operates as sort of a catnap spell in that way, because catnap is instantaneous, but they have to be asleep for 10 minutes during the duration of that spell. Whereas this one just takes 10 minutes to cast and then the effect is instantaneous. But notably, it also no longer adds the spell casting ability modifier to the healing of the spell. But you do get the benefit of a short rest, so you could potentially use some of your hit dice as well and get more healing back that way. Moving on to Protection from Poison, it no longer states that you only end one of the poisoned effects on the target. I don't know if that means that if you have multiple poison conditions on you, I just considered one poison condition, and if you cast Protection from Poison, it would remove all of the poison effect because it's all just one poison condition. That's unclear, but additionally, advantage against poison also extends to ending the condition, whereas previously in 2014, this was only advantage against being poisoned. Moving on to Ray of Enfeeblement, this has had some pretty significant changes. So it's now just a Constitution saving throw, whereas previously this was a ranged spell attack with a follow-up Constitution saving throw. And then even on a successful save, the affected creature still has disadvantage on their next attack roll before the start of your next turn. And then if they fail the saving throw, they have disadvantage on all D20 strength tests. That includes attack rolls, ability checks, and saving throws. And they must also subtract a D8 from all their damage rolls. Previously, the affected creature halved all damage from strength-based attacks if they failed the follow-up saving throw. I feel like I liked the original effect better because that D8 isn't going to scale well, and there's no upcasting on this spell. Basically, the old one is more effective against creatures at higher levels, although, again, it still is a Constitution saving throw, and big high-level creatures usually have good con saves, but there's still a chance that you could, reduce incoming damage from strength-based creatures by half, which is much more significant at higher levels than just a single D8. Moving on to Rope Trick, you can now use a rope that is longer than 60 feet because it no longer specifies the length of the rope, and the material component has now been changed to a segment of rope. Scorching Ray is unchanged. The invisibility had a small material component change where it removed the sprinkling of powdered silver from the material components. Shatter now specifically names constructs as having disadvantage on the saving throw from just creatures who are made of inorganic materials. The Silence spell is unchanged. Shining Smite is just a renamed Branding Smite. It has the special bonus action on hit timing for all Smite spells now, whereas previously you had to precast this and then on your next attack that hits, you would apply the Smite damaging condition. The school was also changed to Transmutation from Evocation. Spider Climb had a small change where the climbing speed is now equal to your speed and not just walking speed. Spike Growth had some small changes where a creature must take the search action to try to spot the affected terrain, whereas previously they could just make any check. It was never specified that there was an action tied to it. Additionally, the material component no longer has the option of 7 small pointed twigs. For Spiritual Weapon, they have the one change here that no one really likes is that it now requires concentration. Of course, the War Domain Cleric now has a feature that allows them to ignore concentration on Spiritual Weapon, but for all other clerics and all other classes, they now need to concentrate on the spell. Let me know in the comments if you intend to ignore that change if you're using the 2024 rules, and what you might give the War Domain Cleric in place of that feature. For suggestion is now limited to 25 words, much like a sending spell or similar effect. Previously, this was 1 or 2 sentences. You also can't make suggestions that would obviously deal damage to the target or its allies, whereas previously this was just something obviously harmful. So again, I think that's a weird change in wording where it just specifically you have to do damage to them and not like, I mean, there are other things you can make them do potentially that are harmful, but they don't deal damage. And then the material component was changed to a drop of honey. Summon Beast was effectively unchanged, although there was a very small, basically meaningless change in the stat block where the name of the attack that they do is called Rend instead of Maul. For Warding Bond, it removed the text that the effect can be dismissed as an action. Of course, we know from my previous video on the spell changes, spell duration rules in 2024 specifically state that dismissing the effects of an ongoing spell that you cast is action-free. Moving on to Web, a creature can now only be subject to the saving throw to be restrained when entering the webs once per turn. And then additionally, the strength check to escape being restrained by the webs now benefits from the athletics proficiency. And then moving on to the last of the second level spells here, we have Zone of Truth, which is unchanged. So moving on to our first to third level spell, we have Animate Dead. To begin with, they removed the text that the DM has the stat blocks for the zombie and the skeleton. Notably, both of these stat blocks are in the player's handbook, so anyone who's planning on playing a necromancer of some kind or planning on just casting Animate Dead, they should have relatively easy access to those stat blocks. And if it's a spell that you're going to be casting more than once, if you're like a necromancy wizard or something along those lines, you're just playing a summoner in that way, make yourself a little Necronomicon and have all the stat blocks of the creatures that you could create or summon using your spells, and so that's available to you, so you don't need to rely on the DM to get those for you. They also changed it so that the creatures no longer defend themselves from hostile creatures if you issue no commands. They simply move to avoid harm. This is a weird change to me because it does say that here like you can issue the command to just like have it guard a doorway or something along those lines, but it's not really going to guard that doorway if it doesn't attack hostile creatures. This wording change is technically more in line with other summon spells. Again, a weird change, but based on even the description of the ways that you can use the zombies or skeletons in this spell description don't align with the fact that they will move out of the way to avoid harm if they are trying to guard a certain position. Moving on to Aura of Vitality, the school was changed to Abjuration from Evocation. This now uses the emanation keywording, although it is mechanically the same. And maybe the bigger change here is that you can actually heal a creature in the aura when you cast the spell and at the start of each of your turns, whereas previously this was a bonus action. So it's actually pretty nice that it's action free to do the healing, but this also does require that your allies who need healing think ahead and move into your space during their turn. So there's just a little bit of change in the way that you think about your strategy. Beacon of Hope is unchanged. Bestow Curse, the third bullet point is only usable in combat, whereas previously in 2014 this said while cursed. And also, while under the effects of that third effect, says that the creature is forced to take the dodge action on their turn, rather than just spending their action doing nothing. So that's actually kind of a buff to the monster, which is a little strange. Of course, the dodge action does benefit them by having disadvantage on all attack rolls against them, as well as +2 to their dexterity saving throws. So I don't know why they made that change, because that's not really a curse. I mean, again, they don't spend their action doing something more productive, but I still think that they should just spend their action doing nothing. There's no reason that the spell should benefit them in any way. Moving on to Blinding Smite. Much like all the other Smite spells, this now has the special on-hit bonus action timing rather than being precast. The blinded condition for this spell is now applied immediately on hit, whereas previously it required a Constitution saving throw when you hit the creature with it. They still make ongoing Constitution saving throws to try to end the blinded condition at the end of their turn. And then they also added upcasting for this to add more damage. Moving on to Blink. Blink had a small change similar to the way that Mirror Image had a small change. So you now roll 1d6 instead of 1d20. And then the effects of the spell happen on a roll of 4 to 6 rather than 11 or higher. The odds remain the same because it's still a 50-50 chance. And then additionally, the ability to dismiss the spell as an action was removed. Like I mentioned before, the spell duration rules make this action free. Moving on to Call Lightning, the storm clouds can now form indoors, whereas previously said that that couldn't happen if there was no space for clouds to form. Additionally, it is now a magic action on each of your turns to call down an additional bolt rather than just a normal action. Clairvoyance was changed, that switching between hearing or seeing through the sensor is now a bonus action from an action, so that's pretty cool. Conjure Animals is functionally a new spell. In 2024, it now creates a large 10x10 spectral pack of animals, non-tangible, so it can occupy a creature space. It grants advantage on strength saving throws to you if you're within 5 feet of that pack. Additionally, when you move on your turn, you can also move where that pack is located 30 feet. So that's effectively action-free. It just moves when you move, and it doesn't necessarily need to move in lockstep with you, so you can kind of move it to wherever you want. And then whenever a creature is within 10 feet of that pack, you can cause them to make a dexterity saving throw or take 3d d10 slashing damage, and then has upcasting for more damage. Moving on to Conjure Barrage, you can now choose which creatures are affected, whereas previously this affected all creatures in the cone, so that's pretty cool. Damage was actually increased to 5d8 from 3d8, so that's a pretty noticeable increase. You can now upcast it for more damage as well, and the material component is now a melee or ranged weapon worth at least 1 copper, which means that it now can't be replaced by a spellcasting focus. Counterspell, I think many of us know already that has been pretty significantly changed. This now requires a Constitution saving throw, whereas previously it was a contested spellcasting ability check if the targeted spell was a higher level spell than the counterspell. It also no longer automatically counters a spell of 3rd level or lower, and it doesn't benefit from any upcasting. Even if it's successful, the caster that you cast counterspell against, they don't lose their spell slot, they just lose their action, bonus action, or reaction. And the reaction trigger now specifies that you need to cast it on a spell that you can see being cast with verbal, somatic, or material components. This was kind of always true. I think this is how we always ruled it, but it now specifically says that. I do like that it no longer benefits from upcasting, because I think one of the feel-bads of being the counterspeller in your group is that you kind of needed to hold on to your higher level spell slot in order to guarantee the counter against higher level spells, whereas you'd rather be holding onto those spell slots to cast your higher level, more powerful spells. But I don't like that it's a saving throw, and I don't like that the other caster keeps their spell slot. I've been kind of comparing this to Remand from Magic the Gathering, where you counter a spell and the spell goes back in their hand. But even then, Remand draws you a card, like you get some extra value out of it. And maybe the drawing a card is the fact that you don't have to upcast it and you can keep your higher level spell slots. But just the fact that you're down a resource and the enemy gets their resource back is just basically delayed for a turn feels kind of bad. And I don't like the Constitution saving throw. I like the contested spellcasting ability check. That feels like, an actual contest between spellcasters. It's not even a concentration check, to where things that affect concentration checks could affect this ability as well. I think if I were going to rule this, I would probably keep the lack of upcasting. I think I would keep it so that it automatically counters spells of 3rd level or lower, but I would keep the contested ability check for spells of higher level. So you don't have the ability to guarantee countering a higher level spell, but of course you can make certain builds with certain subclasses to make that happen. Moving on to Create Food and Water, this now specifically calls out the malnutrition and dehydration hazards, but this is otherwise unchanged. Crusader's Mantle is now considered an emanation, but there's no functional difference. This now affects you and your allies, whereas previously it was you and non-hostile creatures. And this now also applies to unarmed strikes from just weapon attacks. Daylight was changed to be actual sunlight from just regular light, and casting it on objects is now considered an emanation, which is, again, is just an updating of the rules. There's no functional change there. Dispel Magic is completely unchanged. Elemental Weapon is unchanged. Fear has a small change in the material component, where it no longer has the option of a Heart of a Hen. Feigned Death no longer protects the target from disease, as disease mechanics were removed in 2024. Fireball now applies the burning hazard to objects that aren't being worn or carried, rather than just having them be ignited, and there's no mechanics around that. It also no longer goes around corners. Fly now also grants hover, but it's effectively unchanged. While it didn't technically provide hover in 2014, the rules in the player's handbook around flying movement stated that creatures whose speed is reduced to 0 fall out of the sky if they aren't being held aloft by magic, such as by the fly spell. So the fly spell always sort of gave you hover, although it wasn't explicitly called hover. But now in 2024, the spell specifically says you also have hover, which, again, if you don't know, just means that if you fall prone or your speed is reduced to 0, you don't fall out of the sky. Gaseous Form has had a number of changes, so the affected creatures can now use a magic action to end the effect on themselves. Previously, they had no ability to do so, and they were just kind of stuck in that form for an hour if you decided to maintain concentration. This also now provides hover in addition to the fly speed. You now have resistance to bludgeoning, piercing, and slashing damage, whereas previously this was just non-magical damage, so that's kind of a nerf there. You can now upcast this to affect additional targets, and the Wisp of Smoke was removed from the material components. Moving on to Glyph of Warding, this is a kind of a wall of text, but there's only a few changes here. It now requires a Wisdom Perception check to spot the ward, whereas previously this was an Intelligence Investigation check. The Explosive Rune, much like Fireball and other effects, no longer goes around corners, and the Incense was removed from the material components. For the Haste spell, the Utilize action was put in there in place of the Use an Object action, and the spell ending leaves the target incapacitated rather than just they can't take actions. Hunger of Hadar was now changed to actually create darkness, whereas in 2014 this was just called blackness, and there was no actual like darkness keywording or anything that said that it was actually darkness. You can also upcast the spell by choosing additional damage for either the cold damage or the acid damage. You can choose one or the other, but not both. And the material component no longer needs to be specifically be an octopus's tentacle. It could be a tentacle from any creature. Hypnotic Pattern had its material component changed to just a pinch of confetti, which is kind of funny. Lehman's Tiny Hut is now a stationary emanation, which is effectively unchanged. It's technically the same function. Creatures who will be inside the area of effect need to be in that area when the spell is cast. When the spell is cast, if the spell can't fit the creatures in range, then the spell fails. However, there's otherwise no limit on the number or size of creatures that can fit in the dome. Additionally, it's a little weaker now because spells of 4th level or higher can pass through the effect. And finally, the spell ends early if you cast it again. Moving on to Lightning Arrow, this has that special bonus action on hit timing, whereas previously, much like the Smite spells, this was pre-cast, and this also no longer requires concentration. Lightning Bolt had some small changes that it no longer ignites objects that aren't being worn or carried. It doesn't apply the burning hazard or anything along those lines, as well as the rod in the material component can no longer be made of amber or glass. For Magic Circle, the only real change here is that the material component is now salt and powdered silver worth 100 gold or more. Major Image is now a magic action to move the illusion from just an action. Again, much like all illusions, it now requires the study action to investigate the illusion from just a regular action. And it now has the effect of lasting until it's dispelled and is concentration free if you cast it at 4th level or higher, whereas previously this was only if you cast it at 6th level or higher. Mass Healing Word had its school changed to Abjuration from Evocation, and the base healing for it was increased to 2d4 from 1d4. However, the upcasting for it still increases only by 1d4 per slot level. Meld into Stone is unchanged. Non-detection says it's now protection from divination spells rather than divination magic. I don't know how many, if any, monsters have abilities that work sort of similarly to other divination spells, such that the spell non-detection wouldn't protect them from that feature because it's not technically a spell. That feels wrong to me, especially because this has a cost that is consumed associated with the spell. Probably still rule it that any sort of divination type effect from a creature wouldn't be able to pierce through the effects of the spell, but you might rule differently. I don't know exactly why they made that change. If that was their intention or not, but just something worth pointing out. Moving on to Phantom Steed. The Steed now travels at 13 miles an hour by default if you're doing kind of overland travel. Previously, this was only 13 miles per hour at a fast pace and 10 miles per hour otherwise. They also removed the text that the spell can be dismissed as an action, but again, as I mentioned previously, the spell duration rules make this now action-free. Plant growth had a small change where plants can now only be affected by 1 enrichment per year. You can't overlap the effects to sort of extend the duration even longer. You would technically need to wait until the end of that year, until the effects of the spell ended, to then cast it again over the crop. Moving on to Protection from Energy, this one is unchanged. Remove Curse is also unchanged. Revivify is also unchanged. Sending had its duration changed to instantaneous from 1 round. The School was changed to Divination from Evocation. So again, I love to see more divination spells, and it does make sense that sending would be a form of divination. The recipient needs to be a creature you've met or needs to be someone described to you by someone who has met that creature. The recipient's intelligence no longer has a bearing on their ability to understand the message. Then interestingly, a creature now has the ability to block additional attempts to contact them via sending for up to 8 hours before you can do it again. I don't know how often this might come up, but again, if your players are sort of abusing the sending spell by trolling the big bad evil guy by sending them insulting messages from afar, maybe you might have the big bad evil guy turn off notifications for 8 hours so they can't do that anymore. And also notably that the copper wire for the material component no longer needs to be short or fine, it just needs to be any copper wire. Moving on to Sleet Storm. This one I believe is the first time that we've seen the area of effect of a spell change. This now is a 40-foot tall cylinder with a 20-foot radius, whereas previously this was a 20-foot tall cylinder with a 40-foot radius. So that is a much smaller cross-section from the top down. It's also now a taller spell, so it's maybe easier to catch flying creatures. And notably, the ability to maintain concentration is now tied to a dexterity saving throw to avoid falling prone, and the material component was changed to a miniature umbrella. I don't know how much I like the concentration being tied to a dex save, because according to the description of the spell, that is specifically tied to the creatures being on the ground, because the ground is slippery. Technically, a flying spellcaster would be able to avoid that concentration check by getting off the ground. Although I think a DM could reasonably say that the winds created by the sleet storm would impose the same saving throw on flying creatures. I would certainly rule it that way to sort of keep in the same sort of mechanical theme of the old sleet storm. Basically one of the best effects of sleet storm is that it makes them make concentration checks against your spell save DC rather than having to do a bunch of damage to try to get a higher DC. So personally I would like to maintain that as much as possible. Moving on to slow, casting a spell under the effects of slow now has a 25% chance to fail, rather than just having a 50% chance to cause the spell to be cast the next turn. I feel like I prefer the old one because a 25% chance feels like just such like a, it's not like it's not going to happen, but it feels like too low of a chance to happen rather than the 50-50 shot to delay it until the next turn where you could possibly, kill that creature before they can get it off. Moving on to Speak with Dead, the spell no longer works if the creature was undead when it died, rather than just not working on undead creatures. Speak with Plants is now a 30-foot immobile emanation, although this is mechanically unchanged. Spirit Guardians is now a 15-foot emanation. Again, no functional change there. Additionally, the damage triggers now when you move the emanation into a creature space or when they end their turn there and rather than start their turn there. The damage can only happen once per turn, but of course we know from many other videos on this topic that doesn't really stop people from abusing it if they really want to. And additionally, the material component has changed to a prayer scroll from a holy symbol. For Stinking Cloud, the wind speed is no longer specified by the spell. It just says a strong wind, such as one created by Gust of Wind, disperses it. Additionally, the wind immediately disperses the effect instead of taking one round to do so. Creatures that don't need to breathe are no longer not affected by the spell. Then additionally, the material components, the skunk cabbage leaves were removed from the material component options. For the Summon Phase spell, this was added to the player's handbook from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. There's no changes to the base functions of the spell. However, for the stat block, the speed now has a speed of 30 feet and a fly speed of 30 feet, whereas previously this was just a speed of 40 feet. So while it has a slower walking speed, it now has a base fly speed without having to upcast it at all, so that's pretty powerful. Moving on to Summon Undead, this was added to the player's handbook from Tasha's Cauldron of Everything. Again, the base effects of this spell are unchanged. There's only one small change to the stat block where the Festering Aura down here at the bottom left is considered an emanation, but again, there's no mechanical change there. Moving on to Tongues, it now allows the creature to understand sign languages, which is pretty cool. And additionally, if you know sign language, but the person you're communicating with doesn't, they would be able to understand that sign language coming from you. And the material component, the miniature ziggurat, no longer needs to be clay. Moving on to Water Walk, it now grants a bonus action to pass through the surface of a liquid to get inside it. Whereas previously, if you were walking on top of water and you want to get in the water, there is no sort of mechanical way to do that. Additionally, if you cast this on a creature who is submerged in water, it no longer automatically causes them to resurface. And then finally, for the last spell of the third level spells in the last spell of this video, we have Wind Wall. The damage was increased to 4d8 from 3d8. And then for the material components, the fan no longer needs to be tiny and the feather no longer needs to be exotic. And that is it. That is all the changes for the second and third level spells in the Dungeons & Dragons 2024 Player's Handbook. Let me know what you think about like the counter spell changes and how you're personally using them. Are you still using the 2014 version? Are you using a modified version of the 2024 rules? Or are you just using the 2024 counter spell as is? What are your feelings about that one, about delaying the caster spell rather than making them lose their spell slot? I'd definitely be interested to know your thoughts about that one, especially if you've already played with those rules, understanding how that feels. I haven't quite had the opportunity to play with the new rules yet. We actually just finished our old campaign last night. Any of the other spells that I mentioned, how do you feel about those ones? Again, let me know down in the comments. And again, while you're going down in those comments, please hit that like button. Again, if you are a new viewer or returning viewer to these videos and you like what you saw here, you like the format and you want to see more, please consider hitting that subscribe button. Again, we're on our way towards that first 1,000 subscribers, so that's very, very exciting. And again, all of my videos for these spell changes will be available in a playlist. I'll link that down in the description, as well as it's going to be, of course, on my channel page. In my next video, we'll look at the 4th and 5th level spells. And again, I release videos every Sunday and Wednesday, so you have those to look forward to. I appreciate all your guys' time, and I'll see you in the next one.